Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you're well. I am back with a video talking about the importance of decentralization, especially in a world today where the central planners are trying to centralize everything to gain power and control and to micromanage your life. But I wanted to illustrate the destructive powers of centralization or over centralization, neo centralization. They always try to criticize liberalism and free market capitalism, like all right, neoliberalism. So I'll call it neo central planning. But to illustrate this specifically, the destructive powers, I want to go over a clip from my video that I released yesterday with Richard Werner, and then go over some charts to see what has been happening with the banking system in the United States. And I think this is representative of what is happening around the world. So let's cut to the clip of my interview with Richard Werner. There it is.
Okay, right. And they called this window guidance, by the way. So Deng Xiaoping went back and told his people, this is how we're going to do it. I see Japan successful, Germany's doing the same, and also the US, although there's no, as we know, not much of the guidance happening, but the structure of the banking system is also highly diversified, thousands of small banks. Let's have that. And so he departed from the Soviet monobank model. Right. And he created, under his command, they created thousands and thousands and thousands of banks. At the moment, the country with the second largest number of banks in the world is China, after the US. And what was the result? Well, the rest is history. Since he did that, economic growth really took off. We had 4 decades of double-digit economic growth, and more people were lifted out of poverty than anywhere else in any time before in history.
Okay, so what he's talking about specifically is Deng Xiaoping, and when he became ruler, if that's the correct term, in China, he looked at what Stalin had done in Russia, and he wanted to centralize the banking system just like everything else. And this was kind of a mono bank, is what Richard called it. And I can't recall the actual name of the bank, but really it was just one bank throughout the entire country with one branch. Now, the main problem, there's a lot of problems with that, but the main problem is that there's no way that one bank that's completely centralized, run by some bureaucrats in one city, would be able to understand the lending needs and the productive lending needs at a local level, because they don't know the local entrepreneurs, they don't know the technology, they don't know who is creditworthy and who isn't, and therefore the capital creation doesn't go to where it is utilized most efficiently. It goes to all of these larger corporations, and because those are the only ones that the big banks want to do business with, because that's what makes most sense to them. It doesn't make sense for them to do some $500,000 loan or $1 million loan when you're a JP Morgan, as an example. That it takes the same time and energy to do $1 billion loan, or maybe sometimes even less, to do $1 billion loan, depending on who the counterparty is. And obviously, you're going to make a lot more money with the same time and energy. So there's a lot of problems with centralizing a banking system, but the main one is that you just can't allocate capital or credit creation, as Professor Werner would call it, to the appropriate parties to maximize on sustainable economic growth. So Deng Xiaoping looked at what happened in Stalinist Russia and said, you know what, we don't want anything to do with that. And I found it interesting, too, that when I looked up his history, and we'll cut to that really quick here, he was born in 1904 and passed away in 1997. And in let's see here. He worked in France in the 1920s, and he's a follower of Marxism and Leninism, and joined the Chinese Communist Party in 1924. Now, it also says that in early 1926, he traveled to Moscow to study communist doctrines and became a political commissar. So he had firsthand experience with the monobank and under Stalin, and maybe its origins under Lenin. So he saw that front and center. He had boots on the ground research, so to speak. But then when he became the ruler or president of China, and this would have been in 1976, he saw, to Richard's point, he saw what was happening in areas like the United States, in Japan, very close to him, and in Germany, where they had all of these smaller community banks. And he was able to contrast that with what he saw in Russia. And he immediately knew how much more efficient those small community banks were to sustainable economic growth and lifting people, society at large, out of poverty and really benefiting the poor and middle class, lifting the standard of living for everyone across the board. So this is what he implemented one of the strategies that he implemented, which led to 4 decades plus of Chinese economic growth, and what took the country from some sort of third world backwater to what we see today, where it's the second largest economy in the United States, and many project it to be the second largest economy to the United States in the world. And many project it to be the largest economy and overtake the United States by 2030. So now that we understand the importance of decentralizing the banking system, and again, we're just using this as a specific example of how important it is to have a decentralized approach with pretty much everything, not just banking. But let's look at the number of banks in the United States. We'll cut this chart, and we can see going back to 1966, there were 24,000 commercial banks in the United States. Let's see what has happened. Since then, we now have under 6,000 banks in the United States. That is a massive decrease, meaning that is a massive centralization of the banking system. Now, we don't have a mono bank like they had in Stalinist Russia, but we're a lot closer to a mono bank now than we were in 1966. And this chart, by the way, as you can see, probably only goes to maybe 2016, 2017. So I would assume, especially after the cerveza sickness, that we'd have even fewer banks today than we had back when this chart was created. So we are far closer to the mono bank today than we were in, call it, 1966. So if what Professor Werner is correct, that would mean that the banks are a lot larger in the United States. Therefore, they're only servicing or creating credit for larger and larger customers, where you get to a point where they're only interested in doing business with other massive banks, huge corporations, hedge funds, and financial institutions, pension funds. So this really is, I think it illustrates what we've seen, or it explains what we've seen in the United States very well, where we have this move towards the banking system, creating an economy that is far more financialized. So it's more reliant upon asset growth, like the stock market and the real estate market, compared to an economy that actually grows in a more sustainable way, because it's revolving around the production of goods and services in the real economy. Okay, most of you are following what I'm saying. So you're probably asking yourself, or you're saying to me right now, George, I get it. What does this have to do with Bitcoin? I get the Stalinist Russia part. We don't want the centralized banks, and we obviously don't want centralized control over the entire country or the entire state, because that leads to bad things. But let's think about what one of the benefits of Bitcoin. And I'm not here to say that Bitcoin is going to 500,000 or a million or to zero. This has nothing to do with the price of Bitcoin whatsoever. Zero. And this also isn't a video talking about the probabilities that Bitcoin will take over the dollar and become the world reserve currency, or it'll be global money or anything like that. This is more looking at Bitcoin from a philosophical standpoint and understanding the value of sound money and the principles behind Bitcoin, that it allows you to store your own money so you don't have to store that money in the commercial banking system. So if you don't have to store that wealth, if you will, and I hate to use the word wealth because money really isn't wealth, because that's goods and services. So if you have to store your currency units, or the measurement of the amount of currency units you have, or the measurement of your excess labor, your most liquid form of your excess labor, maybe we'll call it that way, call it that to be super specific. But if you can do that and hold it in your back pocket, as opposed to in the banking system, then that is the ultimate decentralized approach. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we create enough credit expansion in an efficient way to maximize on the productive capacity of the economy? But that's a completely separate question. The bottom line is that's going to be a far superior system than the Stalinist approach of the monobank. So we have the monobank over here, and on the far extreme, we have Bitcoin. 100% centralization, 100% decentralization. So even if we can start a discussion around why that is good from a standpoint of Bitcoin, and it doesn't matter if you're bullish or bearish on Bitcoin, that's not relevant to this conversation. If we can just open up people's eyes as to why that is beneficial when we juxtapose it to the other side of the coin, which is the monobank, then people start to ask questions like your friend and family member Fred, and maybe the light bulb will go on for them and say, well, wait a minute. Okay, I totally understand why decentralization of the banking system and money creation is what we should strive for. I understand why that is something that is beneficial to society at large. So if they understand why that could be beneficial, if they understand the merits behind decentralization of money, then the next logical step that you can kind of nudge them towards is, hey, if decentralization works great for money, why wouldn't it work great for government? Reducing the size of government from a federal level, maybe down to the states, and giving more power to the states, more power to the city. It's the same concept. So if you can connect the dots, if your friend and family member Fred can connect the dots with money, I think they should be able to connect the dots easier with the government, and then that leads them to understanding the value of freedom and liberty. So again, this channel is all about standing up for what's most important in all of our lives, because at the end of the day, the amount of Bitcoin you have, the amount of dollars you have, the amount of gold you have, it doesn't matter at all if you don't have freedom and personal liberty.